We have fantastic collections here at Manx National Heritage, over 2 million items.
Archaeology in the Isle of Man is amazing. It's incredibly rich.
Objects are very real connections to the past for people, and the past is very live to them.
It's really trying to bring the digital and the real world together, which again we find really exciting.
On last week's programme, we explored the work of Manx National Heritage not only to preserve the Isle of Man's history and heritage, but also to bring the stories behind the sites and the artefacts back to life for the island community. But how is it possible to balance the static nature of many heritage sites and museums with attracting visitors, many of whom may already have seen what's on offer? Edmund Southworth is Director of Manx National Heritage.
There are some quite deep philosophical issues embedded in that. Some people don't want change, and they come back to a place, and if you've changed it, they're upset. And that's one challenge. Another challenge is the lack of change. For some people, they say, well, I came 10 years ago, it's not changed, why should I come again? So for those people, we try and introduce temporary exhibition programme. But also I think we have audiences who are not traditional museum visitors. I don't know what a traditional museum visitor is anymore. Many of the people who are coming here on holiday is understanding that we have a range of audiences who want a range of things. Not everybody reads voraciously. Not everybody likes listening to things on headphones. So the challenge is to diversify the techniques we use so that there's always one technique that people can use, whether it's sitting down reading a guidebook, or it's taking something away, or listening to it on their mobile phone. Most museum visitors are coming for a social reason. That's a challenge, because if you're going with somebody to a gallery, you're not standing by on your own reading. You have to try and devise a technique that suits everybody.
Director of Manx National Heritage, Edmund Southworth. As Edmund mentioned, one of the mechanisms to encourage people to return to some of the sites is the use of temporary galleries in the House of Manannan and the Manx Museum. And the latest temporary exhibition, Manx Tholtons, opens at the Manx Museum this Saturday, October the 7th. It features the work of photographer Ray Kelly and multimedia artist Niamh Kelly. As well as a formal education programme involving the island's schools, Manx National Heritage also takes steps to involve the broader community in exploring the island's history. Katie King is the Community Outreach and Learning Support Officer.
We have fantastic collections here at Manx National Heritage, over 2 million items. A lot of them are in storage. In my role, people don't always have to come to me or come to us. I can go up to them. So I do something called Every Object Tells a Story, where I literally just rummage in the stores until I find something that's, I think, might look quite ordinary, but I know it's got a great story behind it, because obviously we collect stories connected with the objects, not just the physical object. So I might take that out into the community, and somebody might think, oh, that's all right, it's an old, quite boring dress, really. But when you reveal the history behind it, the story behind it, you can see that sort of switch in people's minds, and they think, oh, actually, that's an amazing object. Thanks for sharing that story. So, yeah, I try and get some of our unsung heroes from the collections and celebrate them. And equally, we try and encourage people to come to our sites who perhaps haven't visited for a very long time. If you go to Rushen Abbey, you don't have to be fantastically interested in the monastic history of the Isle of Man. You might just want to look at our beautiful herb gardens, or you might want to run around the grass and have a picnic. So it's trying to get people to realise that our sites are for everybody on the Isle of Man, whether you're interested in history or not. Our sites are fantastic, creative, imaginative spaces.
Community Outreach and Learning Support Officer Katie King. And we'll hear more about another initiative which aims to make the island's history more accessible a little bit later in the programme. As we've just heard, one of the sites which has been tailored to encourage family visits is Rushen Abbey. We'll find out how shortly, but first, a little about the history of the site itself. Allison Fox is Curator of Archaeology.
Rushen Abbey really began its life in 1134, to be exact, when lands were donated to build an abbey upon this site. It came into being when the Isle of Man was part of the Kingdom of Man and the Isles, which was this sea kingdom during the later Viking Age period on the Isle of Man, really, when the island was really central to this Norse-led kingdom that was interested in trade, really. There aren't a huge number of upstanding building remains from the Abbey period on the site. We've got the church tower and we've got a small part of the chapter house on site, but a lot of the remains were underground. And what we were trying to do was tell a story of the Abbey in its place in the contemporary world when it was started, but also giving information about the lives of the monks who would have lived here. And that was really the main focus of certainly the significance of the site. Alongside that, what we didn't want to ignore was the later, I suppose, more social history of it. Rushen Abbey is one of the sites on the island that's so important to so many local people. I mean, I remember coming here when I was little. The on-site museum was one of the things that first got me interested in archaeology, and alongside that there were the people who met their husbands and wives in the dancing down here. So we didn't want to dismiss that side of the history at all, so we also tried to incorporate that into the story and into the interpretation of the site as well.
Because it has become a place which is more welcoming to families than you'd imagine a site like this would be.
I hope so. We have always been really keen to get young local families at our sites. You know, we don't expect everybody to go away from our sites with the full history of exactly what happened when. What we want people to do is to feel comfortable at our sites, to enjoy them, perhaps go away if they want to have a think about it, find out more, that's great. And Rushen Abbey is one of the really good sites for families because there's a lot of space. You know, we've got the gardens in the southern end of the site away from the more sort of purely monastic remains. And about 3 years ago, we had quite low visitor figures at Rushen Abbey, certainly from the local communities. Local families weren't really visiting. So we had a project to try and refresh the interpretation a little bit, specifically aimed at young local families, to really just encourage them to come in and just enjoy the site as well. And that does seem to have worked. I mean, when we arrived here today, there were some very small people here, young children here using the site. We've had a really good busy summer holidays with local people using the site and coming back as well, not just coming here when they've got family or friends visiting, but they're using the site more regularly, which is really good to see.
Curator of Archaeology Allison Fox. And it's not just young families M&H is keen to open its doors to, as Katie King explains.
An initiative we're due to start in November is called Meet Me at the Museum, a new project whereby we're going to offer dementia-friendly sessions once a month actually in the museum complex. And so what we're doing from November, we've trialled this a couple of times, is we're going to run the sessions within the art gallery, because the art gallery is so beautiful and also really, really calming. It's a calming space. I'm going to rummage in our collections, bring out some really quirky and unusual objects, and we're going to run these for people with older people, particularly isolated older people, and people with dementia, their supporters and families, to come along in a really relaxed environment with tea and cake. So we're always trying to find ways to really enhance health and well-being for people on the Isle of Man, and that's something that I think is a lot overlooked by modern society, you know, thinking about people's health and their happiness. So that's something that I'm really passionate about, and it's something that I really strive to do in my day-to-day work.
And as Katie mentioned, those sessions will be held in the art gallery. Situated in the Manx Museum, it showcases some of the items held in the National Art Collection. But what's contained within that collection? Yvonne Cresswell is Curator of Social History and has the responsibility of curating the hanging of the collection in the National Art Gallery.
This collection has always been, and this goes back to when the museum opened in 1922, it's always been a Manx collection. So the work has to be included either by a Manx-born artist or by an artist who's worked on the Isle of Man and or sort of a very particular Manx subject. So that means that you can have a Manx-born artist who may have worked elsewhere, but then you can also have everybody from a British artist who came here on holiday and was painting Manx scenes, or in the First and Second World War, the civilian internees. So it's a full range of artwork, but it's always Manx in subject matter. I think it actually does mean that Manx art has always kind of punched well above its weight, because people could come in and see, basically national, international quality work, but it's by local artists. And that's something that most people in Britain, if they went to their local museum, they would not see that.
I mean, it's been acquired over a great many decades now, but where did the artworks come from, essentially? Are they donated to Manx National Heritage?
Over the years, the majority of the collection has been donated. Some are bequests, others are purchases. It's a complete variety of material. Unlike a lot of institutions where the primary consideration, it has always been quality, that it has to be a quality work by a quality artist. We might have works of art which you look at and you think, well, it's not a very good painting or drawing. But if that show is the only artistic or photographic visual evidence of a particular site on the island, it has great historical value. So different works can have, importance in different ways. But a lot of our artwork is now available on the iMuseum. So the entire collection of oil paintings can actually be physically viewed online. All of the Knox collection can be viewed online, John Miller Nicholson. So there's different ways of accessing the collections.
Curator of Social History Yvonne Cresswell. As Yvonne mentioned, many of the pieces in the National Art Collection are now available to view digitally by visiting the iMuseum. Collections Information Manager Jude Dickens explains more.
The iMuseum is an online resource for people to use to access all our amazing collections we have at Manx National Heritage, and that's ranging from photographs, artworks. If you're into your family history, that's indexes from our parish registers, and one of our most popular areas on iMuseum, of course, the newspapers. It presents collections in a whole new way. So I can go to iMuseum, and when you're on the homepage, you can type in any word in the Google-style search box at the top, and it will return items for you. But then when you found something really interesting, whether that's a photograph or maybe you found your grandfather mentioned in the newspapers, you can then share that on Facebook or email it to a friend, and you can do it from the comfort of your own home or from your mobile phone or iPad, and that to us is a joy, a real joy. The newspapers themselves, online you subscribe to those, but they are free to use in our Library and Archives reading room at the Manx Museum, which is open Wednesday to Saturday. We have laptops ready to use in the Library and Archives, so come along with any question you have.
Because that's an interesting distinction. When you say iMuseum and searchable archives online, you don't necessarily think of it as a physical location.
Yeah, absolutely. And we relocated that facility to our Library and Archives reading room in the Manx Museum. And the reason we did that is we were bringing resources together. So part of what is on iMuseum is also part of our library collection: books, pamphlets, printed tracts. So when you're in the reading room, if you see a catalogue entry for a book that you then think, I want to see the actual book, then you're in the right place to then go up to the counter and order that book and see the physical item as well. So it's really trying to bring the digital and the real world together, which again we find really exciting.
Collections Information Manager Jude Dickens. And you can find out more about the iMuseum by visiting imuseum.im. But speaking of physical objects, let's go back to Rushen Abbey. It was the site of extensive archaeological excavations in the recent past. But in broader terms, what is archaeology like in the Isle of Man? Curator of Archaeology, Allison Fox again.
Archaeology in the Isle of Man is amazing. I've got a vested interest because I went to St Thomas's primary school, so I used to go to the Manx Museum on my way back from school and everything like that. But having worked elsewhere, the archaeology of the Isle of Man is incredibly rich. But we have important periods of archaeology and history compared to other places. I mean, we do talk a lot about the Viking period on the Isle of Man, and just to take that as an example, we have more Viking treasure that's been found on the Isle of Man than our geographical neighbours have per square mile. It was a very rich place in the Viking Age, offshore financial centre in the Viking Age. Going back in time into the Neolithic, so 6,000 years ago, some of the pottery that we've got is unique to the Isle of Man, and you can see how people on the island at that time have sort of been influenced by people coming in or travelling around themselves, and they've taken little bits of what's happening other places, but they've just given it this Manx twist. So it's different, and you see that. Maybe that shouldn't be too much of a surprise because we've got this sea as a boundary, but there's a lot of not only just artefacts, but there's a lot of stories still out there.
So when you do excavations, you'll find all sorts of things. What happens to them once you've found them?
All the finds from Rushen Abbey are in the national collections, which we look after at the Manx Museum, and they're available for research, not just immediately after excavation, but there are lots of occasions where there's been decades gone by since things were brought out of the ground, and people will come back, look at them and come up with new ideas. To take Rushen Abbey as an example, we have a postgrad research student, Marie Wheel, who's been looking at some of the human remains from Rushen Abbey. Marie has organised some carbon dating and some isotope analysis on one of the skeletons. This particular skeleton, the museum that used to be on site was labelled as King Olaf II, so one of these fantastic Viking kings. And what Marie has been doing has been looking at this particular skeleton in a bit more detail to say if we could say, he might be, or no, it's definitely not. I'm not going to steal any thunder, and the results aren't all in yet, but Marie will be giving a talk in the new year about the results of that. So modern science and archaeology is always changing. The things we can tell about human remains now, when I first started out, you'd need literally half a leg bone to get a radiocarbon date. Now you only need a tiny bit of material. A gram of material can give you a really accurate radiocarbon date. So as long as we approach these research projects sensitively, and as long as we know we're likely to get good results, then even things that were excavated over 100 years ago might be able to tell us new things.
Curator of Archaeology, Allison Fox. Many of the techniques used in conservation have been employed on a special project relating to the Nautical Museum in Castletown. Christopher Weeks is Objects Conservator for Manx National Heritage.
Well, as it's currently constituted, the Nautical Museum is as it was in 1967 when it opened, as a little collection of maritime objects, including sailmakers' tools and things like that, displayed in the 18th century buildings that have belonged to George Quayle of Castletown, who features large in our current plans. On the Isle of Man, as elsewhere, don't have many objects. The reason for this is that the stuff that we lack was workaday and wasn't designed to last forever, and consequently did not. So we've got the high status stuff, but the bread and butter is gone. Of the kind of objects that people would have been familiar with, boat hooks, oars, sails, masts, little boats, clothing, we've got nothing. And neither has anybody else. Well, I say we haven't got anything, but we have actually got, of course, one boat that remains from the 18th century uniquely, and we're very lucky to have that, the Peggy.
Can we go and have a look and see?
Yes, indeed.
So we've come downstairs and we're in the place that used to house the Peggy up until fairly recently.
2015, yes.
Where is she now?
She's an industrial unit up in the Cool Road Industrial Estate. She's housed there in conditions very similar to what we find in the cellar we're standing in now, which is cold, damp, and, well, damp doesn't really cover it, it's wet. But we have to keep the boat, just for the moment, in those conditions to ensure that while we're working on her, she doesn't dry, crack, and fall apart. But the cellar that we're standing in is the boathouse that George Quayle built for her, and it's remarkably well preserved. Later in the life of the boat, George built a little dock for Peggy just outside the cellar we're standing in. We understand this is, now that we've excavated it and discovered it, it appears to be the best preserved dock of its date anywhere, which is extraordinary, dating from about 1800. People always ask me how long it's going to take to conserve the boat. The real question is, how long is it going to take to prepare a new site for her to live in? Because self-evidently she can't stay in a windowless industrial unit in Douglas, and she cannot come back to the cellar from whence she came because we can't secure her in it because it's too wet. So what do? At the moment we're working hammer and tongs to try and bottom out some feasibility studies that are aimed at seeing whether we could bring Peggy back to this site. We definitely want to bring her back to Castletown, but ideally we would like to bring her back to this site. It wouldn't be in the cellar, but it could be in the stable yard next door, which has been owned by the trustees of Manx National Heritage since 1967, but has never been opened to the public. So we're looking at all of that. That, I would suggest, is the more complicated part of this particular recipe, and it's going to take a while to cook.
Will we go outside and have a look at the area you're talking about?
Of course.
So not a particularly large space, but an interesting shape.
Yeah, very interesting. We're standing in the space between Bridge House and what visitors would know as the Nautical Museum. One of the things we'd like to do is to eventually bring this courtyard back into public use, or into public use for the first time actually, and give people an idea of the 18th century ambience that would have met George Quayle's eyes as he'd walked through here, to give an idea about how he actually used this site. Because we're surrounded by 18th century edifices and walls, the stables, his tack room that we just walked through to get here, and we'd like to show people more of this. So that's the main objective here on this site.
So how does the island's maritime heritage and history compare to other areas?
I think it's different in a few obvious ways. We don't have a massive world-beating naval history museum, for example, with warships in it and high-status stuff. But what we do have, like Peggy, or for example, like the naval uniforms of Captain Quilliam, we have things that are preserved in a peculiar way, perhaps peculiar to an island nation such as ours, where objects are very real connections to the past for people, and the past is very live to them. So Peggy is very well preserved, partly for that reason. Quilliam's uniform is very well preserved, partly for that reason. And those kinds of artefacts the Isle of Man can excel in, and those are things that we've got that other people just don't have. So we might not have vast volumes, but boy do we have quality. That's probably the most obvious thing.
And there's an interesting development potentially on Quilliam's uniform.
Yes, there is. Costume Conservator, Textiles Conservator is working on Quilliam's uniform as we speak. What we previously thought were moth holes, we now know, thanks to her, to be burn holes, and what we previously thought were bacterial rust staining, such as you get on old textiles, turned out to be blood spots. And we now think that this coat was worn in battle, and that the holes were formed probably by flying shards of timber. The fact that he preserved the coat suggests very strongly he kept it as a relic. One possible explanation for this was that it was a relic of a famous battle that he'd been involved in, and there is an obvious candidate. And that's the kind of thing that modern conservation can help you discover. But more will be told in due course. The truth will out, but it's certainly one to watch.
Objects Conservator Christopher Weeks. And that uniform will be featured in a new permanent gallery at the Manx Museum. Curator of Social History Matthew Richardson explains more about the project.
We are renovating parts of the Social History Gallery, creating a new military history gallery, which will allow us to showcase some of the uniforms, objects, things that haven't been on display for about 20 years or so now. And we've got very rich military history on the Isle of Man, going back to the Fencibles in the Napoleonic era, right the way through to the First World War, Second World War. And it's also an interesting story, a multifaceted one, because although we've got the stories of people that went willingly to war and displayed great bravery in various conflicts, people like Captain Quilliam, there's also been a strong current in the Isle of Man of opposition to war, and people taking a stand as conscientious objectors. So part of the challenge of this gallery is to presenting that whole rounded story and looking looking at the way warfare has affected not just soldiers, but men, women and children abroad and at home. So again, there's a lot of research, a lot of background work that goes into it before you even start putting objects on display.
Curator of Social History Matthew Richardson. And that new gallery is scheduled to be open in time for the 100th anniversary of the end of the Second World War in November next year. In the meantime, Manx National Heritage's seasonal sites will be open this year until the 3rd of November. And of course, the Manx Museum and the House of Manannan remain open all year round. You can find out more information about any of the sites by visiting manxnationalheritage.im. And this year's series of Heritage Open Days continues this weekend around the island, and you can find out more about those events on the website too. Over the last 2 weeks, we've heard just a small part of what the island has to offer. But just what role does history and heritage play in the island's community? Director of Manx National Heritage, Edmund Southworth.
At its crudest level, most of the houses on the Isle of Man are quite old. Most of the buildings are old. The sheer upkeep of heritage property that other people own, not us, is an important contributor to the island's economy, because we have builders looking after old property. That's economically important. The visitor economy clearly has heritage at its heart. Heritage culture and the natural landscape are what drive people to come to the island. 200,000 people coming to the island, enjoying themselves on holiday, visiting friends and relatives. They're bringing real money. And that money stays on the island. It's what we call the multiplier effect. And then finally, what does it mean to be Manx? The culture, the heritage, the identity and community of the island really is deeply embedded in this enormous, great and complicated history that we have.
And those words from Director of Manx National Heritage Edmund Southworth bring us neatly back to the question we asked at the start of last week's programme. When was the last time you explored the island's history and heritage? We'll leave the last word this evening to Community Outreach and Learning Support Officer Katie King. Have a very good evening.
I know that museums can change lives and make people happier, make communities happier. So that's what we try to do. So, and I don't think we celebrate that enough on the Isle of Man. That it's such a beautiful place to live. Your heritage, your culture, your island can make you happier if you embrace it.